Greetings. Yesterday we went over Zechariah and the episode he had in the Holy of Holies with St. Gabriel and getting muted. Now we're going to do Mary's espousal to Joseph today. So, this is a huge subtext in the text, birth, childhood, and youth of Jesus. This is the subsection we're at. The subtext is Mary espoused to Joseph. Joseph was the third of 6 brothers. His parents dwelt in a large mansion outside of Bethlehem. It was the ancient birthplace of David, but in Joseph's time, only the principal walls were in existence. His father's name was Jacob. In front of the house was a large courtyard or garden. In it was a stone spring house built over a spring whose waters gushed forth out of faucets, each of what represented some animal's head. The garden was enclosed by walls and surrounded by covered walks of trees and shrubbery. The lower story of the dwelling had a door, but no windows. In the upper story there were circular openings, over which ran around the whole top of the house a broad gallery with 4 little pavilions capped with cupolas. From those cupolas, a view far into the surrounding country was afforded. David's palace in Jerusalem was provided with similar towers and cupolas. It was out of one of them that he saw Bathsheba. Above the center of the flat roof arose another small story, likewise crowned by a tower and cupola. Joseph and his brothers occupied that last story with an aged Jew, their preceptor. The latter occupied the highest room in the story, while the brothers slept in one chamber, their sleeping places separated from one another by mats, which in the daytime were rolled up against the walls. I have seen them playing up there, each in his own separate space. Dead toys shaped like animals, like little pugs. Their preceptor gave them all sorts of strange instructions that I could not understand. He laid sticks on the ground in various figures and stood the boys in them. The latter stepped into other figures, which they had formed by rearranging the sticks. They laid sticks also in various positions as if for measurement. I saw too the father and mother of the boys. They did not appear to trouble themselves much about their children, for they paid very little attention to them. They, the parents, appeared to me to be neither good nor bad. Joseph was perhaps 8 years old. He was very different from his brothers, very talented, and he learned quickly. But he was simple in his taste, gentle, pious, and unambitious. The other boys used to play him all kinds of tricks and knock him around at will. They had little enclosed gardens, at whose entrance there stood on pillars covered images like swaddled infants. I often saw similar figures on the curtains of oratories, those of Anne and the Blessed Virgin, for instance. The only difference was that Mary's picture held in its arms a chalice above which something arose. In Joseph's parental home, these images were like swathed infants with round faces, environed by rays of light. There were many such pictures in Jerusalem, especially in the olden times, and also among the decorations of the temple. I've seen them in Egypt also. And among the idols that Rachel purloined from her father were similar figures, though smaller. Many of the Jews had swathed puppets like them lying around in little chests and baskets. They were intended to represent the child Moses in his little basket, and the swathing signified the binding power of the law. When gazing at these figures, I used to think, the Jews honored the little image of the child Moses, but we have images of the child Jesus. In the boys' little gardens grew bushes, small trees, and plants. I saw that his brothers often stylily trod down and tore up the plants in Joseph's little garden. They always treated him roughly, but he bore all patiently. Sometimes when kneeling in prayer in the colonnade that ran around the courtyard, his face turned to the wall, his brothers would push him over. Once I saw one of them, when Joseph was thus praying, kick him in the back, but Joseph appeared not to notice it. The others repeated his blows until at last Joseph fell to the ground. Then I saw that he had been absorbed in God. But he did not revenge himself, he merely turned away quietly and sought another secluded spot. Outside and adjoining the garden wall were some small low dwellings. In them dwelt two elderly veiled females, as is often the case near the schools. They were servants. I saw them carrying water into the house. The domestic arrangements were smaller to those of Joachim and Anne's house, the beds rolled up and wicker partitions before them. I often saw Joseph's brothers talking with the servants' maids and helping them in their work, but Joseph never interchanged words with them. He was always very reserved. I think there were also some daughters in the family. Joseph's parents were not well satisfied with him. They would have wished him, on account of his talents, to fit himself for a position in the world, but he was too unworldly for such aims. He had no desire whatever to shine. He may have been about 12 years old when I often saw him beyond Bethlehem opposite the crib cave, praying with some very pious old Jewish women. They had an oratory hidden in a vault. I do not know whether these women were relatives of Joseph or not. I think that they were connected with Anne. Joseph often went to them in his troubles and shared their devotions. Sometimes he dwelt in their neighborhoods with a master carpenter to whom he lent a helping hand. The carpenter taught him his trade, and Joseph found his geometry of use. The hostility of his brothers at last went so far that, when 18, Joseph fled from his father's house by night. A friend, who lived outside of Bethlehem, had brought him clothes and wished to make his escape. I saw him in Labona carrying on carpentry. He worked for his living in a very poor family. The man supported himself by making such rough wicker partitions as those Joseph knew how to put together. The latter humbly assisted the family as far as he could. I saw him gathering wood and carrying it into the house. His parents, in the meantime, believed that he had been kidnapped, but his brothers discovered him, and then he was again persecuted. Joseph, however, would not leave the poor people nor desist from the humble occupation of which his family was ashamed. I saw him afterward in another place, Tanakh. There he did better work for a well-to-do family. Though a small place, it had a synagogue. Joseph lived very piously and humbly, loved and esteemed by all. At last, he worked for a man in Tiberias, at which place he lived alone near the water. Joseph's parents were long since dead, and his brothers scattered. Only two of them still dwelt in Bethlehem. The paternal mansion had passed into other hands, and the whole family had rapidly declined. Joseph was deeply pious. He prayed much for the coming of the Messiah. I noticed, too, his great reserve in the presence of females. Shortly before his call to Jerusalem for his espousals with Mary, he entertained the idea of fitting up a more secluded oratory in his dwelling. But an angel appeared to him in prayer and told him not to do it. That is, in ancient times, the patriarch Joseph became by God's appointment the administrator of the Egyptian granaries, so now to him was the granary of the redemption to be wedded. In his humility, Joseph could not comprehend the meaning of this, so he betook himself to prayer. At last he was summoned to Jerusalem to be espoused to the Blessed Virgin. There were 7 other virgins who were with Mary to be dismissed from the temple and given in marriage. On this account, St. Anne went to Jerusalem to be with Mary, who grieved at the thought of leaving the temple. But she was told that she must be married. I saw one of the distinguished old priests, who was no longer able to walk, borne into the Holy of Holies. An incense offering was enkindled. The priest prayed sitting before a roll of writings, and in vision his hand was placed upon that verse in the prophet Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, in which it is written that there shall come forth a rod out of the root of Jesse, and a flower shall rise up out of his root. Thereupon I saw that all the unmarried men in the country of the house of David were summoned to the temple. Many had made their appearance in holiday attire, and Mary was conducted to their presence. I saw among them a very pious youth from the region of Bethlehem, who had always ardently prayed to be allowed to minister to the advent of the Messiah. Great was his desire to wed Mary, but Mary wept. She wished not to take a husband. Then the high priest gave to each of the suitors a branch, which was to be held in the hand during the offer of prayer and sacrifice. After that, all the branches were laid in the Holy of Holies, with the understanding that he whose branch should blossom was to be Mary's husband. Now, when that youth who so ardently desired to wed Mary found that this branch, along with all the others, had failed to blossom, he retired to a hall outside the temple and, with arms raised to God, wept bitterly. The other suitors left the temple, and that youth hurried to Mount Carmel, where, since the days of Elijah, hermits had dwelt. He took up his abode on the mount, and there spent his days in prayer for the coming of the Messiah. I saw the priests after this hunting through different rolls of writing in their search for another descendant of the house of David, one that had not presented himself among the suitors for Mary's hand. And there they found that, among the 6 brothers of Bethlehem, one was unknown and ignored. They sought him out, and so discovered Joseph's retreat 6 miles from Jerusalem, near Samaria. It was a small place on a little river. There Joseph dwelt alone in a humble house near the water, carried on the trade of a carpenter under another master. He was told to go up to the temple. He went, accordingly, arrayed in his best. A branch was given to him. As he was about to lay it upon the altar, it blossomed on top into a white flower like a lily. At the same time, I saw a light like the Holy Spirit hovering over him. He was then led to Mary, who was in her chamber, and she accepted him as her spouse. The espousals took place, I think, upon our 23rd of January. They were celebrated in Jerusalem, on Mount Zion, in a house often used for such feasts. The 7 virgins that were to leave the temple with Mary had already departed. They were recalled to accompany Mary on her festal journey to Nazareth, where Anne had already prepared her little home. The marriage feast lasted 7 or 8 days. The women and the virgins, companions of Mary in the temple, were present. Also many relatives of Joachim and Anne, and 2 daughters from Gophna. Mary's lambs were slaughtered and offered in sacrifice. I have had a clear vision of Mary in her bridal dress. She wore a colored woolen underdress without sleeves, her arms encircled by white woolen fillets. On the breast and as high as the neck lay a white collar ornamented with jewels, pearls, etc. There came a kind of gown open in the front, wide like a mantle from top to bottom, and with flowing sleeves. This gown was blue, embroidered with large red, white, and yellow roses and green leaves, something like the ancient vestments worn at Mass. It fastened around the neck on the white collar. and the lower border was edged with fringes and tassels. Over this was a kind of scapular of white and gold flowered silk, set over the breast with pearls and shining stones. It lay upon the front opening of the dress and reached to the edge of the same. It was about 2 feet wide and fringed with tassels and balls. A corresponding strip hung around the back, while shorter and narrower ones fell over the shoulders and arms. These lappets were caught under the arms from the front to the back with gold cords, or delicate chains, with which the broad upper piece of the bodice was fastened, as also the breastpiece that was placed over the upper body. By this arrangement, the flowered stuff of the dress was puffed out between the cords. The wide sleeves were tightly fastened in the middle of the upper and lower arms by buckles, puffing out around the shoulders, the elbows, and the wrists. Over this costume fell a long sky blue mantle. It was fastened at the neck by an ornament, and over it was a white ruffle, seemingly of feathers or silk dots. The mantle fell back from the shoulders, forming a large fold on the sides, and hung behind in a pointed train. It was embroidered around the edge in flowers of gold. Mary's hair was arranged with such skill as is difficult to describe. It was parted on the top of the head and divided into numerous fine strands, which were caught together with pearls and white silk. It formed a large net that fell over the shoulders and down the back to the middle of the mantle. It looked like a web. The ends of the hair were rolled in, and the whole net edged with fringe and pearls. On her head was placed first a wreath of white raw silk or wool, closing on top with 3 bands of the same meeting in a tuft. On this rested a crown about the breadth of one's hand, set with many-colored jewels. 3 pieces arose from the circlet and met together in the center, where they were surmounted by a ball. In her left hand, Mary carried a little garland of red and white roses made of silk, and in the right a beautiful candlestick covered with gold. It had no foot, but was furnished like a scepter with knobs above and below the point at which it was to be grasped by the hand. The stem began to swell out in the middle and ended in a little dish upon which burned a white flame. On her feet she wore heavy sandals about 2 fingers in thickness, under which, before and behind, was a support like a heel. They were green and gave the foot the appearance of standing upon sods. 2 straps, white and gold, went over the foot and held them in their place. The virgins at the temple arranged Mary's skillfully woven hairnet. I saw them thus engaged. There were many busied with it, and the work went more swiftly than one could imagine. Anne brought all the beautiful clothes, but Mary was so modest that it was only with reluctance that she allowed herself to be arrayed in them. After the nuptial ceremony, her braided hair was wound around her head, a milk-white veil reaching up to the elbows thrown over her, and the crown placed upon it. The Blessed Virgin had auburn hair, dark eyebrows, fine and arched, a very high forehead, large downcast eyes with long dark lashes, a straight nose, delicate and rather long, a lovely mouth, around which she played a most noble expression, and a pointed chin. She was of medium height, and she moved very gently and gravely, looking very bashful in her rich attire. After the marriage feast, she wore another dress, It was striped and less magnificent than the one described. I have a scrap of it among my relics. The striped dress she wore at Cana and on other holy occasions. She wore her wedding suit once again in the temple. The very wealthy among the Jews changed their dress 3 or 4 times during a marriage feast. Mary, in her magnificent apparel, presented an appearance somewhat similar to the richly adorned women of the much later period. The Empress Helena, for instance, and even Cunegundis herself. The usual clothing of the Jewish women enveloped them closely, giving them an appearance of being wrapped up. But Mary's wedding dress was very different. It was something on the Roman style. Joseph wore a long, wide blue coat fastened from the breast down with loops and buttons. The wide sleeves were laced at the sides, a broad cuff turned up at the wrist, the inside provided, as it were, with pockets. Around the neck was something like a brown collar, over which lay a kind of stole, and upon the breast hung 2 white bands. After the marriage, Joseph went to Bethlehem on some business, and Mary, with 12 or 15 women and maidens, went on foot to Anne's house near Nazareth. When Joseph returned, I saw at Anne's house a feast at which, besides the usual household, there were about 6 guests and several children present. Cups were on the table. The Blessed Virgin wore a mantle embroidered with red and white and blue flowers. Her face was covered with a transparent veil, over which was a black one. I afterwards saw Joseph and Mary in the house of Nazareth. Joseph had a separate apartment in the front of the house, a 3-cornered chamber this side of the kitchen. Both Mary and Joseph were timid and reserved in each other's presence. They were very quiet and prayerful. Once I saw Anne making preparations to go to Nazareth. Under her arm she carried a bundle that contained some things for Mary. To reach Nazareth, which lay in front of a hill, she had to go over a plain and through a grove. Mary wept very much when Anne was leaving, and accompanied her a part of the way. Joseph was alone in his apartment in the front of the house. Mary and Joseph had, properly speaking, no regular housekeeping affairs. They received from Anne all that they had needed. I saw Mary spinning and sewing too, but yet with wide stitches. The clothes yet worn had not many seams and were entirely in strips. I saw her embroidering also, and with little white sticks knitting or working. The cooking she did was very simple, and while it was all going on, the bread was baking in the ashes. They used sheep's milk, and of meat generally pigeons only. End of reading. All right, so notes. If I said some sentences during this one that were sounded a bit sarcastic, is because I really had trouble with the sentence structure in this one. And I had to stop and start and stop and start and stop and say it was frustrating this morning. Anyways, first note, when reading this, I wondered why Joseph didn't hit up his family when there was no room at the inns in Bethlehem when Mary was about to give birth to Jesus. But then I guess the question answered itself as I was reading. Kind of interesting how this great saint was mixed up with a family like this. A lot of saints come from saintly people, I think of Thérèse de Lisieux. She was born to saintly parents, and Mother Mariana de Jesus Torres is born to a saintly family, people who are very much consecrated, like Essenes. Joseph didn't come from Essenes. He came from sort of a more poshy background. But yet he's still, yeah. Now, what's funny is I'm a third born male, and so is my father. I'm the third born male. I'm the last of the 4 children, though my father was the 7th born in his family of 13 children. But my household was pretty ordinary too, and my brothers wouldn't leave me alone when I was a kid, so I kind of knew what he was going through. Though I confess, rather than praying, I was yelling at video games in my youth, so I wasn't saintly like Saint Joseph. I'm sorry, I was not. We can all aspire to be great saints like Joseph, I suppose. But unfortunately, some of us just aren't. We aren't there yet. Let's put it that way. I got a long ways to go. Next note. I had to get through these more quickly. My dad was also talented, on top of his being able to water survey, and having a knack for outdoor survival. He was smart. He played music, and he made wooden carvings that were quite skilled with the hand. Like, he was really good at it. Only problem is my dad was very draconic, unlike Joseph. And unfortunately, I caught too much of that trait as well. So what I mean by draconic is someone who always lives to triumph over others rather than living for the glory of one who is above them. It's a prideful type of thing. You're always looking for instances where your pride gets bolstered rather than looking to give everything you have to God. So he had a chip on his shoulder and looked for triumphs when being really talented. When you think of a talented saint, like the guy to aspire to is, we think of St. John Bosco, who is extraordinarily talented. A saint that astonishes you with the kinds of things he could do. But talent is something of this world. It's a matter of whether or not you give it to God. My dad carved things of nature, moose, deer, bears. I wondered what would have come of him if he did not have the chip on his shoulder, because we see that some celebrities are extremely charming. They have great singing voices, but then they use their voices for vainglory. And I like watching YouTube videos of girls singing reverently, like finding videos that are sung by 3 talented singers who sing Psalm 50 or Byzantine chants or whatnot. And their voices, they aren't as good as celebrities, but their songs are so regenerative to listen to. Like, especially if you got exposed to a lot of degenerative TV or crap on the internet. I'm just gonna label it all crap. Well, your image of people gets damaged. Your image of women, especially if you're male, your image of women gets damaged. And so what you want to do is, when your image of women is damaged, I find this helped me a lot because of all that I was exposed to. When you watch videos of women singing reverently to God and dressed modestly and whatnot, it sort of regenerates your image of them. It's just the way it goes. And then when you think of women, you think more of this than the ugly, disgusting stuff the world shows you through the TV. So the point I'm making here is that we, even despite given a bunch of talents, we can use it for regenerative purposes or degenerative purposes. Common theme with me. When you give back to God, your soul regenerates, and it is like it is made complete. When you spend time with God, when you spend time looking at people doing godly things, this is why the Mass is so important. We have to witness the priest in front of the altar praying reverently to God. Oh, geez, that probably made noise. Anyways, praying reverently to God, having his arms stretched high, looking up towards the crucifix. And we're deprived of that because They do ad populum rather than ad orientem, which faces the east. Every every altar should face the east. And when we do ad orientem, it allows us to witness the reverence another human being has for God, and it has a regenerative effect on us, and it puts that into our hearts. That's why it's so important to pray, so important to watch people who pray, so important to watch people who give due reverence. Next note. How he met Mary is very Disney-like, but we kind of got the same thing with King David. The prophet Samuel went to David's family. This was in 1 Samuel chapter 16. And he knew he was to anoint one of the sons, and so they all lined up, but the person wasn't there, and one of the sons wasn't there, and Samuel was like, you got other brothers? And they'd be like, oh, just one, but it can't be him, because he spends all days with the lambs. Then Samuel would be like, yep, it's him. Joseph was just a happy young man living in the little house down by the river. I'll just quote 1 Sam 16 here. I don't remember which verse it is, something like 7. And the Lord said to Samuel, look not on his countenance, nor on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. Nor do I judge according to the look of man, for man seeth those things that appear, but the Lord beholdeth the heart. So this was no different. The Lord beholdeth the heart of Joseph, not among these other men of David. And we get that one example of the guy who really wanted to be with Mary. And then he went and hermited himself to the Assyrians. Oh my goodness. I'll do another aside here. I watched this silly show that it came out in Canada called Son of a Critch, and they did episodes on a very effective episode, I must say, contrasting an old priest who is very severe and a new priest who is this kind of hippie, very like, oh, I don't do confessions in confessionals. We're gonna sit right here, pal, and you can confess to my face. And woof, I don't like these kind of priests. But then the boy asks him, well, why did you become a priest? And he's like, oh, well, I broke up with my girlfriend. and you're thinking, these are real stories, by the way. And you know that a lot of post-Vatican II priests, they're running away from girls. They go be priests. That's what this reminds me of, that young man who really wanted to marry Mary and he couldn't. So it's like, F it. And hey, who can blame him? Okay, you're looking at the pinnacle of creation. You're like, well, if I'm not getting that, you're setting it on a star at the top of existence. If I'm not getting that, then no women for me. So, hey, maybe. So, I looked into it. David was not the third born of his family. I was wondering, hey, is there a parallel here? Nah, I guess it doesn't go that far. David was apparently one of the younger ones. They didn't actually say how many brothers were older or younger than him. They just said he was one of 7 brothers. So, next. His parents not being pleased with him reminds me of the novel by Jane Austen, Sense and Sensitivity. One of her best written characters is Eleanor, the narrator, the heroine of this one, who's a bit of a Mary Sue, unlike many other of her heroines with flaws. But she has an interest in Mr. Edward Ferrars, who was from a rich family, but was more interested in a humbler living like Joseph was. I reference this because Austen has that uncanny talent of contrasting her characters to the environments they're living in so that it draws out their behaviors in contrast to the other behaviors. Just like when you read Pride and Prejudice, we know who Elizabeth and Jane are because they're contrasted by their three younger sisters who are very much shallower. So it tells us a lot about the person that Edward Ferrars was by contrasting that he came from a very rich and posh family, but he was a guy who adored humble living. And Joseph, I guess, was the same circumstance. So, yeah, it's interesting. And we get this from Joseph here. What's funny about this? Okay, I just thought of this. Jane Austen wrote around 1810, and so did and Catherine Emmerich. These writings are actually contemporary. That's just a coincidence, though. So next note. We now know that Joseph did not hold the rod of Aaron. I wondered, back when we were reading about Arcos, and was Arcos his name? I'll just call him Arcos, the priest of the Essenians. We now know it was not the rod of Aaron that he held that caused it to sprout. It was just a branch. That rod of Aaron was an artifact kept by the Essenes. Now, next note. This is the reading we get a proper description of the person of Mary, which I went over a few times. We get a proper description of her in Mystical City of God too, although it is a little bit different. A little. Mystical City of God, she said she was taller. Like a little bit taller than most women. And I think of the statue of Our Lady of Good Success, which was measured by Mother Mariana. And the statue measures about 5 feet 9 inches. And I wonder if 5 feet 9 was Mary's actual height. But Anne Catherine describes her as being average height, which would have meant like 5'5". So who knows? Her hair is described here as auburn or chestnut. You often hear chestnut. The face described as oblong, kind of like an oval, but the eyebrows described as perfectly arched. The nose described as long and delicate. The forehead usually being described as high. The mouth is small. Mystical City, she said her eye color was dark, but with a hint of green. I used the image of Mary that's faded because a mystic drew it, and I believe it's authentic, that this was Mary. And her eyes look actually quite different, like they almost look Korean. Like you look at eyes around the world and Korean eyes look much like this, like not like, I mean Korean eyes from very pretty Korean girls who don't have the thick eyelids, but just have those kind of open eyes. They're very open and curious looking. So anyways, it would be an interesting experiment to draw what she looked like in all of her wedding stuff. Now, the wedding itself, next note, I used to talk with 2 Sikh women, and they have pretty extravagant weddings, and this Jewish wedding reminded me of that. Multiple days, etc., etc. This day and age, it would be really expensive, but back then, I'm guessing it was more closely knit, and more like a potluck where everybody brought stuff, and they just all festived in the stuff, rather than giving, I don't know, they probably gave household knickknacks and whatnot, but it was probably mostly for the feast. So maybe you'd invite like 20 people tops, and you'd do the multiple day feast, and then your neighbors would just show up because they were your neighbors. And then back then, you were much closer to your neighbors if you all attended the local synagogue. So they'd have been like relatives to you. You would have been very much like brothers, especially if you traveled on the road together to attend the feast in Jerusalem. So, next note, I drew the priest, our host, and all his gear. I might try Mary and all this gear, but it'll be much harder. I'll have to do it with a pencil, I'm sure, if I can find one. But the truth is, I don't really like to draw that much. It's kind of long and tedious. I can scan it easy, but it's still long and tedious. I do think it would be cool if someone drew Mary described in this chapter. I mean, if I was that obsessed with it, I would take it beyond drawing. Now, I use AI generated images, but AI, you can only do so much with it, because the more you describe it, the more AI will just go off and do its own thing. So AI, you sort of take what you can get, and you only get, I only have so many credits to try this with, because I use MSN's generator. And you only get so many tries with it. So I can't sit there and type descriptions and descriptions and descriptions until I get it correctly. I only get what I get. So I take the prettier ones and just give people eye candy, which is my goal with that. That's why they don't accurately depict the text. Maybe there are AIs that are much better at picking up on prompts, because you feed them prompts with adjectives, and they're supposed to use your adjectives to alter their images. Problem is like I said, I remember one time I used an AI model I wanted to show Mary and Jesus, and Jesus comparing Mary to the Ark of the Covenant. So Mary would have her hands over her belly as though she were pregnant, and her belly would represent the Ark of the Covenant. And you know what I got back? Jesus pregnant. It's like, oh, come on. Come on, man. But that's AI. And when you type in word like breast, they think of a woman's naked breast rather than the breast of a chest. So they're like, this is using words that aren't quite matching up, or that are against the standards or the conduct of this program. And it's like, breast, really? So anyways, you get what you get. Now, I have 4D modeled before, because I liked playing with mods in Skyrim. I play Skyrim a lot. Like, I'm still a gamer. And you can do it. I just don't want to. It's so much work. Next note. The culture around sending girls to the temple at a young age and marrying them off at 15 is rather interesting, and I could do a whole psychological foray into why girls should stay away from boys, but I won't here, because that is a 40-minute video in and of itself. Last note. In Mystical City of God, one thing we didn't get in this text that we got in Mystical City is that Mary and Joseph had to straighten out right away the status of chastity. Now, obviously, you marry a nice, young, pretty girl, and there might be expectations there from the outside. But it was revealed that they were both really nervous about discussing it, because I don't even know where they married. In this book, they said they married, I think, in Nazareth. But anyways, they had to discuss it as they were going to their house. And Joseph, it was revealed, had sworn a vow of chastity in his youth at the age of 11 or 9 or something like that. And Mary then revealed, oh, well, I swore a vow of chastity. Oh, perfect. So there's a lot more fleshed out of this matter in Mystical City. It's not only the chastity issues, but when Joseph noticed that Mary was pregnant, there was a whole long chapter about that, about his anxieties, about what was going through his head, about he felt feelings of betrayal, and it was like a diabolical attack on him that he was meant to endure to draw out his faith. And it was rich. Mystical City of God is rich in spiritual stuff. And this is why I appreciate both of these readings, because of how comprehensive they are and how much they complement one another, even if they have divergences or discrepancies. Because here we get more of what happened in the flesh, while Mystical City gives us more of what happened internally and in the spirit. Anyways, that's it. Ave Maria. Sorry this video was long.